How do you create that perfectly balanced logo design? As a designer, you might have heard of the principle of balance, but what is it and how does it apply to logos specifically? Let's have a look at some real-world examples to demonstrate, and by the end of this short video, you'll be armed with a series of considerations, general rules to guide you through any style of project. So what is balance? In any kind of visual design, balance is the distribution of visual weight. Just as in product design of physical products, industrial design, objects want to be balanced so they're not, ridiculously heavy at one end and light at another, meaning they're falling over, they're difficult to carry around. So we apply the same things visually into our design so they look right. So there's some sense of gravity, there's some sense of how this would work in the physical space to our design as we distribute the weight visually. So in something like a layout, it would be unusual in a book, for example, to just throw everything into the top left corner. Instead, the designer is more likely to bring the examples on this right spread over to that right margin to counterbalance that large item on the left spread. So symmetry is the most obvious way of achieving balance. If everything is the same on both sides, then the thing is balanced, right? And that can definitely work. This is the logo for the Highline by Pentagram, Paula Scher's office. And this is symmetrical both horizontally and vertically. So very symmetrical. And obviously it's a very simple form. But this is not the only option available to us, the only way to achieve balance. We can also have asymmetrical logos. We just need counterbalancing elements to make them work. So with the famous Apple symbol, we can see the counterbalancing effect of the stem or leaf at the top. Because the bite is out of the right hand side, the leaf leans over to the right. If it was to lean over to the left, then there'd be too much weight on the whole left hand side and it wouldn't work as well and be as visually pleasing. So how do you decide on these things, like whether to be symmetrical or asymmetrical? Well, there's some things to consider, and this is what I want to give you in this video, considerations, so that as your skills develop, you apply these principles and your logos become better and better. So first of all, what are you trying to say? And this is the beginning for any sort of branding exercise. What are we trying to communicate? That is the real key question. So when you have a sense of that, do we want harmony or tension? Is this something exciting or is it calming? Is it something reliable and with heritage, or is it something that's new and disruptive? When we have a sense of that, that helps guide us in our visual decisions. As designers, we translate that and we create the visuals that are appropriate for this scenario. So with something like the US Open tennis, for the decision making here to go with an asymmetrical logo, because there's a sense of movement, there's the dynamism, the movement that comes in the sport. So this tennis ball looks like it is moving at an incredibly fast rate. Similarly with Formula One, who recently changed this monogram symbol, that's their main identifying logo, F1. And again, it leans, it tilts to the side, so it's asymmetrical. It's balanced because we've got a similar sort of white space in the top left to the bottom right corner, but it has that sense of moving forward. To the right is forward, looking forward as we read from left to right, and that makes sense for this kind of thing. They're not looking for stability and heritage and that kind of thing, although they have that within the sport. The dynamism, the speed, the intensity, the excitement is the most important thing, and this leans forward. So stability is another consideration that you want to think about when you're pulling your symbols and your logos together to ensure that they are balanced. So something like the Adidas symbol, these three stripes, it's asymmetrical, but because it sits on this flat horizontal plane, it feels stable. It has that sense like of being a pyramid or some kind of structure like that. And that's what gives it a balance. Also with like the Louis Vuitton monogram, this L, because it is lower down and the horizontal bar at the bottom gives like a ground, a base to the thing, and that makes it feel more stable than if the L was higher up. And also notice how they're using the counterbalancing elements within the space. So normally with an L, the stem is vertical, but here they've made the stem lean, and that's created not only the space you normally have on the top right of an L, but also space on the top left, which allows the V to sit in both of those spaces and make the overall mark feel balanced and become something which is desirable and immediately increases the value of a handbag. Consistency is another really important consideration in logo design in general. So things like stroke weight. If this CNN logo didn't have that same white stroke all the way through, or the red bars, we know different sizes, then it would just be a mess. And it's the fact that it is very consistent and uniform that it makes overall just a graphical appearance. This now is something that we just recognize in an instant. If we see this on a social graphic or masthead of a website, straight away we know the news outlet we're looking at. And this comes through repeated usage, but also because it's such a strong graphical symbol, a graphical form that has been created from these characters, that it's able to be recognized instantly. The consistency can be seen more when we have more detailed identifying marks. So I made a recent video about all the crests in the English Premier League football, and this is the old crest for Brentford Football Club. And here, the founded 1889 type and the football club type are actually different sizes. They look almost the same at first glance, but football club is larger, and Brentford actually mentioned this on their official website as one of the reasons why they changed their crest. There were inconsistencies, there were technical errors within it, and you don't want things that are nearly the same but not quite. That's just going to look amateurish. It's not going to look like it's been done deliberately. So stroke should be the same weight, type should be the same size, or there should be a clear contrast between them so we know these things are not supposed to be the same. Crests are useful, and crests and these more complicated logos are useful because they have more detail that we can analyse. If we look at another football team's crest, Burnley Football Club, we can see that the lack of consistency that lets it down. Now, first of all, the overall form is awkward because we've got a shield within a shield and the banner sits, in between. But also there's some inconsistencies. If we zoom in, on the outside we have this gradient effect, but that's not applied in the center where we have solid colors. So then the gradient creates all these different yellows, and then we just have the one yellow in the center. But then also the illustration style, that gradient around the edge looks very modern, vector-like, with that shield shape. And also do the rivers. So you see this apex, they look like ladders up to the middle. That represents two rivers in the town. And that's done in a very stylized way, in the claret colour of the team, not the colour of a river, because it's like these steps, these right angles, very stylized, not a flowing river. And then we have the similar thing with the diamonds. But then when it comes to the lion at the bottom, it's a very hand-drawn style. And then also that hand-drawn style is then continued with the hand and the bees. That doesn't marry up. But those elements I just described, the lion, the hand, they use negative space to create the form. But then the stork, the bird on top of the shield, doesn't use negative space. It has colours and then stroked outline. And then even here, the thickness of the outline is not the same as the stroke which defines the bird's wing. All these little inconsistencies, I could go on, just make the whole thing look a mess. Proportion is another important consideration to achieve balance. So have a look at these combination marks. This is a typical arrangement. Symbol on the left, word mark to the right of it. And for these huge brands and well-known online brands too, they have this arrangement, but all of them, if we had some guidelines, have a slightly different proportion. So they don't have the same cap height relative to the height of the symbol. With HSBC, that height is a little bit smaller. It's less than half. With Spotify, it's probably more like around half. With MailChimp, somewhere in between, perhaps, and maybe it looks like just over a third, something like that. And there's no hard and fast rule here. When you have a symbol and then you want to create a combination mark to make it exactly half the height or a third of the height, or using the golden ratio, I would try all those things, but it's about graphically, do they appear balanced together? Look at Spotify, and that solid green circle is quite a heavy element, but it takes up a similar amount of visual weight to the type. Type doesn't feel as heavy because of the counters within it, the space around each character. So it's marrying that visual weight. Because of this, you'll almost never see type which is the same height as the symbol. It can work occasionally, but it tends to be that in this linear arrangement, the height of the type is going to be smaller than the height of the symbol. And determining this, another good way, if you look at Spotify, where I've roughly drawn these grid lines, the baseline and the cap height of the type roughly align with the lines within the circle, the top and bottom of those. And gridding is my next tip for helping you create proportion. In these examples here by George Boker, you can see that the mark itself, the double width of the mark, you know, how it's symmetrical, you know, the shape, how it opens up there, the book type shape. And then we have the horizontal line, the vertical line, sorry, that comes down the right hand side of the symbol. That the top and bottom of that determine the cap height of the first line of type and the baseline of the second line of type. You can see the grid here. So this gridding, as a general rule, using grids can help you when you're building your symbols to ensure that the symbol looks balanced. It gives you a deliberate place in which to place things, but it can also help lead and guide cues from the symbol and from the wider grid that you build for where type and other elements should sit within combination marks. But these rules or these conventions are kind of replaced when you put the symbol above the word mark. So now, instead of the type being smaller than the symbol, we have the width of the type being wider than the width of the symbol on the options on the examples on the left. Now with the examples on the right, they're roughly the same size. With MBC, it's maybe slightly smaller, but in general, when you have a stack combination, the type tends to be the same width or wider than the symbol. And that's because with proportion, overall, we want to have square proportions. We want something that fits roughly in a square. We don't want a super wide rectangle or a super narrow rectangle, because that's going to be difficult to work with as a logo. Imagine that on a social media avatar or anywhere really. It's not going to work very well on signage, you know, on business cards, on uniforms, on website, anywhere. We want a more square proportion in general for marks. And so that's why, again, we just want to finesse this. I mean, even with Rolex, that crown is quite tall. So because of that, they've made it fairly small in the overall scheme so it doesn't dominate the word mark too much. So comparison, as we've just done with 4 up of those stacked logos, is a really useful tool as you create your designs. So even with something like the Apple logo, maybe the designer had something like this across his Illustrator artboard. He's pulling them together, and he or she would have been looking at these and going, clearly we need this to lean to the right to counterbalance that bite. And you can see here very clearly balance in effect, and that the left-hand option is a much stronger one than the right. But you can also compare your work to that of existing logos. So looking at this example at the bottom, the National Trade Association of Field Hockey Stick Manufacturers, this is obviously made up. This creates this like inverted T shape because we've got a very tall symbol and a very wide word mark combined with it. And that creates all this negative space in the top corners. That's something that we don't want, and it's going to be very unworkable. So maybe the designer would think, I'm going to just, let's shorten to an abbreviation, a cipher of FHSM. But then again, we've got that linear, very tall rectangle, and that's going to be unworkable. And just putting it next to some high quality stacked word marks, like these 2 examples here, can help you see sometimes some of the problems. So compare various different versions of your work next to each other to see if the balance is improving as you're iterating through your design. And also have a look at existing logos. How do they balance the size of the symbol versus the size of the type when you're creating combination marks? And the final thing that will help you with achieving your balance is creating alternates. So these examples here for the San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance from Pentagram, Michael Beirut's office in New York, are good examples. We have a symbol by itself. We have a symbol in this roundel with the type going around the circle. And then we have the linear horizontal word mark with stacked type. And this is a thorny problem, a very long brand name. We've got 5 words here. And they've really made good use of this by creating logos that work within that squared proportion and also providing alternates. So if there's perhaps, a signage and we've got that sort of horizontal space, or we want something that's a lot more legible, we have that bottom option too. So creating these will ensure that you've got balance working in every situation. As I said earlier, every situation is different, but if you keep these considerations in mind as you continue to develop your skills, they will give you a better chance of achieving that expertly balanced logo. If you enjoyed this video and would like to learn more design principles with me, then check out our Core Design Skills program. Or if you want to expand beyond logos into a full branding service, then have a look at Brand Design Mastery. Until next time, happy designing.